In his college days at Williamsburg, young Thomas Jefferson was a towering figure, standing at 6 feet 2.5 inches with a slender frame, a face dotted with freckles, sandy hair, hazel gray eyes, and large extremities. He was the epitome of health and vitality, standing tall and straight as an arrow. It was during his final year at Williamsburg that Jefferson, then a mere 22 years old, found himself standing outside the courthouse, listening intently to his friend Patrick Henry as he delivered his famous speech. The fiery words of the great orator, railing against the Stamp Act, left an indelible mark on Jefferson's passionate nature. They took root in his fertile mind, and in just a few short years they would bear fruit in the cause of freedom. Despite their shared devotion to the cause of liberty, Jefferson and Henry were vastly different men. While Henry was a gifted orator, Jefferson struggled with public speaking. His true power lay in his writing, which was both graceful and forceful, earning him the title of the Pen of the Revolution. At the age of 29, Jefferson married a lovely young widow of 23. After their wedding celebrations, the newlyweds set out in a 4-horse carriage for Jefferson's home, Monticello, which was over 100 miles away. But a fierce snowstorm soon overtook them, forcing them to abandon the carriage and continue their journey on horseback over treacherous mountain roads. When they finally arrived at Monticello, exhausted and famished, they found the house dark and the fires extinguished. But the bride and groom wasted no time in kindling a fire, finding refreshments, and filling the empty rooms with their laughter and song. And so began their long and happy married life in the beautiful home of Monticello. Jefferson and his wife both inherited wealth. At the time of their marriage, he possessed 5,000 acres of land and 52 slaves. A year later, his wife's father passed away, leaving her with a vast estate of 40,000 acres of land and 135 slaves. Jefferson grew fond of his mountain home and the life of a planter, taking great care in cultivating the grounds and introducing new varieties of plants and trees. Despite his private interests, Jefferson was a man of public spirit. In the year following his marriage, the famous Boston Tea Party occurred, where taxed tea was dumped into Boston Harbor. This event was followed by the Boston Port Bill, the first meeting of the Continental Congress, and the battles of Lexington and Concord. Finally, the brave men of the Continental Congress decided that the time had come for the American people to declare themselves free and independent of England. They appointed a committee of 5 to draft the Declaration of Independence, and Jefferson was one of them. Due to his literary ability, he wrote the first draft of this great state paper. Congress made a few minor changes to Jefferson's draft, but left it mostly intact. On July the 4th, 1776, all members of the Continental Congress signed the Declaration of Independence in Carpenter's Hall, Philadelphia, which still stands today. One of the most memorable lines in the Declaration of Independence was Jefferson's assertion that all men are created equal. He was always democratic in his beliefs, striving to benefit both the rich and the poor. In Virginia, there was a law that required landowners to pass their land down to their eldest son. Jefferson replaced this law with one that allowed all children in a family to share in their father's land. Another law in Virginia required people to pay taxes to support the established church. Jefferson found this law to be unjust, and worked to pass a new law that prevented anyone from being forced to pay taxes to support any church. Thomas Jefferson was a man who valued the rights of others, both in his public and private life. His household was numerous, and he won their personal attachment through his kind and loving nature. His letters to his daughters were full of loving advice, and their letters to him were filled with genuine affection. After the Revolution, Jefferson was sent to take the place of Franklin, who had returned from his mission as minister to France. When he returned home to Monticello after 5 years, his slaves went miles to meet him and give him a hearty welcome home. They even wanted to take the horses from the carriage so they could draw it themselves. When Jefferson arrived at the house, they bore him proudly upon their shoulders, laughing and crying for joy because Massa had come home again. Jefferson was a truly polite man, with warm sympathy for others, especially the poor and needy. Once, while out riding with his grandson, they met a poor child who bowed to them. The young man paid no attention to the poor child, but Jefferson politely returned the bow, saying, "Do you permit a poor child to be more of a gentleman than yourself?" This taught the young man a useful lesson. After holding many high offices in the country, Thomas Jefferson became the third President of the United States in 1801. He had serious misgivings about some of the ceremonies and formalities in the executive mansion while Washington was president. He loved Washington, but he did not think that the President of the United States should be coldly formal and hold himself aloof from the people as much as Washington did. He believed in Republican simplicity, which he began to practice on the very day he was inaugurated. On that occasion, he went on foot to the Capitol, dressed in his everyday clothes and attended by some of his political friends. Later, when going up to the Capitol on official business, he rode on a horse, which he tied with his own hands to a fence nearby before entering. He declined to hold weekly levees, as had been the custom, but instead opened his house to all on the 4th of July and the 1st of January. In these ways, he was carrying out his convictions that the president should be simple in dress and manner, or, in other words, should live in Republican simplicity. Many of Jefferson's acts prove that he was an able statesman, but one of the greatest things he did while president in the years 1801 to 1809 was the purchase of Louisiana. This territory was far more than just the state of Louisiana. It included all the land between the Mississippi River on the east and the Rocky Mountains on the west, and from Canada on the north to Texas on the south. In the year 1763, after the final French War, France relinquished this vast region to Spain. However, in 1800, Napoleon coerced Spain into surrendering it back to France. When the Americans became aware that Louisiana had once again become French territory, they were apprehensive. The nation that possessed Louisiana could dominate the mouth of the Mississippi and prevent all American goods from passing down the river. Consequently, American settlers residing west of the Alleghenies would be unable to find a convenient outlet to the world for their products. Furthermore, France might establish a robust colony in Louisiana, thereby causing untold trouble for the American people. As a result, President Jefferson dispatched Monroe to France to assist in securing New Orleans and a stretch of territory in Louisiana located on the east bank of the Mississippi. By acquiring that territory, the Americans would possess the entire east bank of the river and could, therefore, control their own trade. The Americans approached Napoleon at a propitious time, for he was in dire need of money to assist him in his war with England. Additionally, he feared that England might seize Louisiana with her fleet. Consequently, he willingly sold us all the immense territory of Louisiana for $15 million. By scrutinizing a map, you will gain some understanding of its vast expanse. It was significantly larger than all the remaining territory that we held before this acquisition was made. Jefferson himself, perhaps, scarcely comprehended the magnitude of what he was accomplishing for his country when he made the purchase. After his term of office as president, Jefferson retired to private life in his beloved home of Monticello. Renowned not only for his statesmanship, but also for his erudition, he was dubbed the Sage of Monticello and was visited by people from near and far. The number of his guests was staggering, with his housekeepers occasionally having to provide 50 beds for them. The weight of entertaining was a heavy load, and the cost of it nearly bankrupted him. Nevertheless, his life was a contented one. Always engaged in some meaningful pursuit, he took a keen interest in education and was the founder of the University of Virginia, a source of immense pride for him. On July the 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, this remarkable man passed away at the venerable age of 83. His tombstone at Monticello bears an inscription, penned by his own hand, that reads, "Here lies Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, the Statutes of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and the father of the University of Virginia." It was his unwavering commitment to the principles of freedom that touched the lives of all men, and in pursuing this noble cause, he found his greatest fulfillment. Chapter 20. Robert Fulton and the Steamboat. In the wake of the Louisiana Purchase, a great multitude of settlers joined the ever-growing wave of westward migration that had been initiated by the early pioneers. These intrepid frontiersmen had traversed the mountains by way of the forest trail, leading their pack horses, or later on, by way of the rough road that had been hewn through the forest, with their household goods packed into sturdy wagons drawn by oxen or horses. However, this arduous method of transportation was soon replaced by the flatboat, which, although safer and more convenient, was still unsatisfactory except when it floated downstream. Consequently, in the early 19th century, the increasing demands of migration and traffic spurred many inventive minds to tackle the problem of applying steam power to river navigation, with the hope of achieving a swifter means of travel and transportation. The first person to succeed in inventing and putting into practical use a steam-driven boat was none other than Robert Fulton. Born to poor parents in 1765 in Little Britain, Pennsylvania, Robert Fulton's father passed away when he was only 3 years old, leaving his mother to take charge of his education. She taught him herself until he was 8, and then sent him to school. However, he had no fondness for books and made slow progress. Drawing and mechanical devices absorbed his interest, and nothing gave him greater pleasure than to visit the workshops of mechanics, and there, with his own hands, to bring his new ideas to life. Legend has it that Robert once arrived at school late one morning and, upon being reprimanded by his teacher, explained that he had been at a shop hammering a piece of lead into a pencil. At the same time he produced the pencil and remarked, "It is the best that I have ever used." Upon examining it, the schoolmaster was so impressed that he praised Robert's effort, and in a short time nearly all of the pupils were using the same kind of pencil. His brilliant ideas found expression in other ways. Take, for instance, the 4th of July celebration in his hometown. It was customary to light candles, but one year candles were scarce, and the citizens were asked to forego the usual display. Robert, only 13 at the time, was bursting with patriotic fervor, as any boy his age would be. He put his mind to work and, using gunpowder and pasteboard, created homemade skyrockets that exploded mid-air, much to the astonishment of the community. Such fireworks were entirely new to the townspeople. Another example of his inventive gift dates back to his boyhood days. He and a friend would go fishing in a flat boat, which they propelled with long poles. But Robert grew tired of this method and fashioned 2 crude paddle wheels, one for each side of the boat, connected by a double crank that the boys turned together. They could now easily navigate the lake and enjoyed this novel and effortless way of fishing. While still young, Robert won the warm regard of Benjamin West, a great painter whose father was a close friend of Robert's father. This friendship likely sparked Robert's interest in painting. In any case, the desire to become an artist took hold of him so strongly that at the age of 17, he went to Philadelphia to study drawing and painting. He spent 3 years there, painting with such skill that he not only supported himself, but also sent money home and saved $400, which he used to buy a little home for his mother. Eventually, his interest in art led him to London, where he studied under Benjamin West. But before long he became fascinated with improving canal navigation and developing various mechanical devices. In the pursuit of invention, his love for painting was ultimately overshadowed. It was his work in innovation that brought him fame. At the age of 30, he ventured to Paris to experiment with his own invention, a diving boat designed to transport gunpowder cases underwater. The first attempt was unsuccessful, but within 3 years he constructed another diving boat and successfully tested it in Brest. He descended 25 feet below the surface with 3 companions and remained underwater for an hour. In 1805, he tested it again in England and used a torpedo weighing 170 pounds to blow up a 200-ton vessel. The world owes Fulton a debt of gratitude for his invention of the torpedo boat, but it is his first successful steamboat that deserves deeper appreciation. While in Paris, he met Robert R. Livingston, the American minister to France, who had a keen interest in steamboat navigation and was willing to provide the necessary funds. A steamboat was constructed in Paris and was ready for its trial trip in the spring of 1803. However, the boat broke in two and sank to the bottom of the river due to a weak frame that could not support the heavy machinery. Fulton rushed to the scene and worked tirelessly with his men for 24 hours to raise the machinery and place it in another boat. The exposure to the cold water caused him to develop a lung problem from which he never fully recovered. After discovering the defects in the machinery, Fulton returned to America in 1806 with funds from Livingston to construct another steamboat, which he named the Clermont, after Livingston's home on the Hudson. The boat was 130 feet long and 18 feet wide, with a mast and a sail, and 2 exposed wheels on each side measuring 15 feet in diameter. On a morning in August 1807, a crowd gathered on the banks of the North River in New York to witness the trial of the Clermont. Many expected failure, and had labeled Fulton as a crack-brained dreamer. They called the Clermont Fulton's Folly, and were ready to jest at his failure. However, Fulton proved them wrong as the Clermont successfully moved down the river, marking a significant milestone in steamboat navigation. At last the signal was given, and the Clermont began to move slowly before coming to a complete stop. "I told you so!" exclaimed one onlooker with great emphasis. "I knew the boat wouldn't go," said another. "It's impossible," said a third. But they spoke too soon, for after a brief adjustment of the machinery, the Clermont proudly steamed up the Hudson. As she continued on her journey, people from far and wide gathered along the riverbanks to witness the strange sight. When the boatmen and sailors on the Hudson heard the clanking machinery and saw the great sparks of fire and the volumes of dense black smoke rising out of the funnel, they believed the Clermont to be a sea monster. In their superstitious dread, some of them went ashore, some jumped into the river, and some fell on their knees in fear, believing the day of judgment to be at hand. One old Dutchman even told his wife that he had seen the devil coming up the river on a raft. The 150-mile trip from New York to Albany was completed in just 32 hours. Success had finally rewarded this man of strong common sense, quiet modesty, and iron will. The Clermont was the first steamboat of practical use ever invented. From that moment on, men saw the immeasurable advantage to trade of steam navigation on lakes and rivers. This was Fulton's final work of great public interest. He passed away in 1815, having rendered an untold service to the industrial welfare of his country and the world. Chapter 21. Andrew Jackson, the Upholder of the Union. In the wake of the Clermont's triumphant voyage up the Hudson, a mere 4 years later, the first steamboat on the Ohio was christened in Pittsburgh. This vessel was the precursor to a multitude of steam-powered crafts that swarmed the vast network of rivers west of the Allegheny Mountains. This fresh impetus spurred on westward migration, as settlers could now easily and inexpensively reach the fertile lands of the Mississippi Valley. With an abundant crop, they could successfully send their surplus to the eastern markets. Under such favorable conditions, the West grew in population with astonishing rapidity. As wealth grew alongside the increase in population, the people of the West gained greater influence in the country's affairs. By 1829, one of their own ascended to the presidency, becoming the 6th President of the United States. This man was Andrew Jackson, hailing from Tennessee. Born in Union County, North Carolina in 1767, Andrew Jackson was the son of poor parents who had emigrated from Ireland just 2 years prior. They built a crude log cabin in a small clearing in the woods and settled down to hard work. However, Andrew's father passed away soon after, and his mother took her children to live with her brother, where she spun flax to earn money. She had high hopes of making a minister out of young Andrew and sent him to school to learn reading, writing, and a bit of arithmetic. But he had little interest in his studies and made little progress. In fact, he never learned to spell well or write English with ease or accuracy. Andrew found great joy in hunting and rough-and-tumble sports, excelling in running, jumping, and wrestling. Though not particularly robust, he was wiry and energetic. When a stronger boy threw him to the ground, he was so agile that he always managed to get back on his feet. As a young lad, Andrew was a barefooted, freckle-faced boy with a slender frame, bright blue eyes, and reddish hair. He was known as Mischievous Andy for his lively and fun-loving nature. Although he was brave and always ready to defend the weaker and smaller boys, he could sometimes be overbearing, and his quick temper often got him into trouble. One day his companions played a practical joke on him by secretly overloading a gun and daring him to shoot it. Fearless little Andy seized the gun and shot it off, but was kicked violently upon his back. He quickly jumped up, his eyes blazing with anger, and shouted, "If any of you boys laugh, I'll kill him." The boys did not laugh. When the revolution broke out, there was severe fighting between the Americans and the British near his home. Andy's love of action, which up to that time had expressed itself in outdoor sports, now took a more serious turn. War became a passion for him, and from this time on he could not visit the local blacksmith shop without hammering into shape some form of weapon. Once, while fiercely cutting weeds with a scythe, he was heard repeating these words, "Oh, if I were a man, how I would sweep down the British with my grass blade." In a few years young Andy had real British soldiers to fight, for he was only 13 when he was made a prisoner of war. One day, soon after his capture, a British officer ordered him to clean his muddy boots. The fiery youth flashed back, "Sir, I am not your slave. I am your prisoner, and as such, I refuse to do the work of a slave." Incensed at this reply, the brutal officer struck the boy with a cruel blow with his sword. Andrew saved himself from the brunt of the blow, but received 2 severe wounds, the scars, and the bitter memory of which he carried through life. These indignities were just the beginning. He was transferred to the prison pen near Camden Jail, some 40 miles away, where without shelter and almost without food, he suffered from heartless exposure. In a weak and half-starved condition, his wounds yet unhealed, he fell a victim to smallpox. Hearing of his wretched plight, Andrew's mother secured his release and took him home with her. Andrew struggled for months with a severe illness. Before he had entirely recovered, his mother died, leaving him quite alone in the world. But these hardships passed, and years later Andrew decided to become a lawyer. After studying law for a while, at 21, he crossed the mountains with an emigrant party into the backwoods region of Tennessee. Now grown to manhood, he was 6 feet and 1 inch tall, slender, straight, and graceful, with a long, slim face and thick hair falling over a forehead beneath which looked out piercing blue eyes. When he reached Nashville, the destination of his party, his experience was, in a large measure, the same as that of Daniel Boone in the wilds of Kentucky. When the women of the settlement went out to pick berries, and when the men hoed corn in the clearings, some of the settlers, with guns in hand and watchful eyes, stood guard against attack from stealthy Indians. To the dangers belonging to backwoods life, Jackson was greatly exposed. The courthouses in which he had to try cases as a public prosecutor were in some instances hundreds of miles apart. In going from one to another he journeyed alone, and sometimes had to remain alone in the woods for 20 nights in succession. In periods of unusual danger he dared not light a fire or even shoot a deer for fear of Indians. But amid all these dangers he escaped harm, and by his energy and business ability achieved success as a lawyer. In time he acquired the means to become a large landowner. After his marriage he built a house which he called the Hermitage, on a plantation of 1,100 acres, about 11 miles from Nashville. Here Jackson lived with his wife, whom he loved with a deep and abiding affection. They kept open house for visitors and entertained large numbers of guests at a time, treating the rich and poor with the same hospitality. His warm heart and generous nature were especially shown in his own household, where he was kind to all, including his slaves. Having no children, he adopted 2, one of whom was an Indian baby boy who had lost his mother. Of these children Jackson was very fond. Childlike simplicity was always one of his striking traits, even as he rose to fame. He never gave up his corncob pipe, even when he became a noted man. However, we must not think of him as faultless, for he was often rough in manner and speech, and had a violent temper that got him into many serious troubles, including some foolish duels. After one of his duels, with a ball in his shoulder and his left arm in a sling, he led an army of 2,500 men in an attack upon the Creek Indians, who had risen against the settlers in Alabama. These Indians had captured Fort Mims, which was in southern Alabama, about 40 miles north of Mobile, and had massacred 500 men, women, and children seeking shelter there. Although Jackson was weak from a long illness, he marched with vigor against the Creeks. In the campaign he endured much hardship, increased by the difficulty of feeding his 2,500 men in a wild country, where they almost starved for lack of food. Under such conditions, Jackson had to exercise much firmness and tact to keep his army from deserting and returning home. The following incident is told to show in what way he won the confidence and love of his men. A soldier, gaunt and woe-begone, approached the general one morning while he was sitting under a tree eating, and begged for some food, as he was nearly starving. "It has always been a rule with me," replied Jackson, "never to turn away a hungry man when it was in my power to relieve him, and I will most cheerfully divide with you what I have." Putting his hand into his pocket, he drew forth a few acorns, saying, "This is the best and only fare that I have." But in spite of all his drawbacks, Jackson conquered the Creeks, and thus broke for all time the power of the Indians south of the Ohio River. Not long after, he was dispatched to New Orleans as a major general to lead an army against the British, who sought to gain control of the lower Mississippi and the southern part of the Louisiana Territory. Upon arriving in New Orleans, Jackson was in such poor health that he could barely sit on his horse. Nevertheless, he worked tirelessly day and night, equipping his men and urging them to confront the overconfident British enemy. The British army was comprised of 12,000 veterans who had recently defeated Napoleon. It was only natural that they looked down on the American backwoodsmen. With twice as many soldiers as the Americans, their confidence seemed justified. On January the 8th, 1815, the British launched a fierce attack on the American lines. However, they were met with such devastating resistance that after just 25 minutes, they were forced to retreat with a loss of 2,600 men killed or wounded. The Americans, on the other hand, lost only 21. The unwavering courage and tireless efforts of Old Hickory, as Jackson was affectionately known by his men, had secured a resounding victory. Jackson's military reputation quickly made him popular, and his honesty and patriotism resonated with the people. In due time, he was elected President of the United States. A man of intense emotions, Jackson loved his friends and hated his enemies with equal fervor. Furthermore, he believed that anyone who disagreed with him, particularly in political matters, could not be his friend. As soon as he became president, he began replacing government officials with members of his own political party who had helped him win the election. This marked the introduction of the spoils system into our national civil service. We can easily envision that a man of such warmth and yet such intolerance would acquire both friends and foes. However, no one questioned his sincerity, particularly when it came to the well-being of his nation. His complete impartiality and strong sense of duty are exemplified by his handling of the Nullification Act. Due to a high tariff passed to safeguard manufacturers in the North, South Carolina declared that no such law would be enforced in their state. This declaration was known as the Nullification Act. Jackson himself was not in favor of a high tariff, but he was resolute in his belief that any law passed by Congress should be enforced in every state of the Union. Therefore, when he learned of South Carolina's actions, he rose to the full extent of his executive power. The news reached him as he was calmly smoking his corncob pipe. In a burst of anger, he exclaimed, "The Union! It must and shall be preserved. Summon General Scott." Troops were quickly dispatched to enforce compliance, and South Carolina withdrew its opposition. In 1837, after his term as President of the United States ended, he returned to his former residence, the Hermitage, where he resumed the life of a hospitable planter. He was now almost 70 years old and suffered from constant illness. Nevertheless, he fought on with his usual stubbornness for several more years. He passed away in 1845 at the age of 78, one of the most remarkable figures in American history. His swift and decisive action in compelling South Carolina to obey the tariff laws did much to reinforce the Union, as it prepared the nation to fend off the greater danger of secession, which South Carolina spearheaded 28 years later. Chapter 22. Daniel Webster, the defender and expounder of the Constitution. In the South, there was a growing sentiment that the Union did not hold power over the states. Andrew Jackson's firm condemnation of the nullification movement came at a crucial moment. On the other hand, the North believed that the Union was superior to the states and had the authority to enforce any law passed by Congress, unless the Supreme Court deemed it unconstitutional. The question of which viewpoint was correct sparked a long and bitter struggle between the two regions. Daniel Webster, a great statesman, championed the northern perspective. Webster was born in 1782 in Salisbury, New Hampshire, among the rolling hills. He was the 9th of 10 children born to a poor farmer. As a frail child, he was unable to work much on the farm, so his parents allowed him to spend a great deal of time fishing, hunting, and exploring the hills. This gave him a deep appreciation for nature and a wealth of knowledge that would serve him well in the future. He was fortunate to have an old English soldier and sailor as a companion on his outdoor adventures. Despite their age difference, the two were close friends and often walked together along the streams. The old soldier regaled Webster with thrilling tales of adventure on land and sea, while the boy read to his friend from books that the old man enjoyed. Webster's father had also been a soldier, having served in Indian wars and the Revolution. He shared many fascinating stories with his son, including one that particularly captured young Daniel's imagination. It was about a meeting he had years before with General Washington, during the time when Arnold was discovered to be a traitor. In that encounter, Washington had taken Webster's father's hand, looked him seriously in the eye, and said, "Captain Webster, I believe I can trust you." This expression of confidence from the general to his subordinate left a lasting impression on the boy. In such ways did his love for country receive a great boost. A particular event that occurred when he was only 8 years old illustrates the gravity of his mind. He stumbled upon a small cotton handkerchief with the Constitution of the United States printed on it at a store near his home. He eagerly gathered up his small earnings, amounting to 25 cents, and secured the treasure. From this remarkable copy, he learned the Constitution word for word, so that he could recite it from beginning to end. Naturally, this was an unusual feat for an 8-year-old boy, but the boy himself was exceptional. He spent most of his time engrossed in books. Although they were few in number, they were of excellent quality, and he read them repeatedly until he internalized them. He found it pleasurable to memorize beautiful poems and noble selections from the Bible, as he had a natural aptitude for learning and remembering what he learned. In this manner he filled his mind with the highest form of truth. Unsurprisingly, his father was proud of his son and yearned to give him a good education. One day when Daniel was only 13 years old, they were toiling together in the hayfield when a college-educated man who was also a member of Congress stopped to converse with Mr. Webster. After the stranger left, Mr. Webster expressed to his son his deep regret that he himself was not an educated man, adding that due to his lack of education, he had to work hard for a meager return. "My dear father," said Daniel, "you shall not work. Brother and I will work for you, and we will work ourselves to the bone, and you shall rest." Then Daniel, whose heart was tender and full of deep affection, wept bitterly. "Listen, my child," spoke Mr. Webster. "It don't matter to me. Nowadays I live only for my kids. I couldn't give your older brothers the chance to learn, but I can do something for you. Work hard, seize your opportunities, learn, and when I'm gone, you won't have to go through the struggles that made me an old man before my time." These words reveal the father's sincere intentions. The following year, the boy, now 14, attended Phillips Exeter Academy. The headmaster began Daniel's examination by asking him to read a passage from the Bible. The boy's voice was so melodious and his reading so insightful that he was allowed to read the entire chapter and was admitted without further questioning. This was only one example of his remarkable talent as a reader. Teamsters would stop at the Webster farm just to hear that Webster boy, as they called Daniel, read or recite poetry or verses from the Bible. The boys he met at the academy mostly came from wealthy and cultured families. Some of them were impolite and laughed at Daniel's simple attire and country manners. Naturally, the poor boy, whose health was still fragile and who was naturally shy and independent, found such treatment difficult to bear. But he studied diligently and soon earned respect due to his high rank. However, one of his school duties, standing before the school and delivering a speech, he found impossible to perform. He would memorize and practice his declamation, but when called upon to speak, he couldn't rise from his seat and go to the platform. During his 9-month stay at the academy, he failed to overcome his deficiency in declaiming. After leaving the academy, he studied for 6 months under Dr. Woods, a private tutor, who prepared him to enter Dartmouth at the age of 15. Although he proved to be a youth of great mental prowess, he didn't excel in scholarship, but he continued to read extensively and thoughtfully, acquiring valuable knowledge that he used with great clarity and force in conversation or debate. While at Dartmouth, he overcame his inability as a declaimer and gave striking evidence of the oratorical power for which he later became famous. After 2 years in Dartmouth, Daniel implored his elder brother Ezekiel to join him. But Ezekiel was needed at home, for their father, now 60 years old, was in poor health and had to work hard to provide for his family. He had mortgaged the farm to send Daniel to college, and sending Ezekiel too seemed foolish. However, when Daniel offered to teach and help, the matter was arranged. After graduation, Daniel taught for a year and earned the money he had promised Ezekiel. The following year he studied law and was admitted to the bar. As a lawyer he was very successful, sometimes earning $20,000 in a single year. However, he could not manage his finances and was always in debt due to his reckless extravagance. Webster was a man of vast ideas who did everything on a large scale. He believed in the Union above all else and opposed state rights. To him the Union was first and the state second, and making the Union great and strong was his life's passion. Webster's profound reverence for the Union is best expressed in his speeches, particularly his famous reply to Hayne. Senator Hayne of South Carolina had argued that the authority of the state was greater than that of the Union, citing the Constitution to support his claim. Webster, a senator from Massachusetts, had only one night to prepare his response. However, he knew the Constitution by heart, having studied it since childhood when he learned it from a cotton handkerchief. Senator Hayne's speech was a masterful one, causing many to question whether even Daniel Webster could answer his arguments. New Englanders in particular feared the dangerous doctrine of state rights and anxiously awaited the outcome. On the morning of January the 26th, 1830, Mr. Webster entered the Senate chamber to deliver his memorable reply. A crowd of eager men and women awaited him. "It is a critical moment," said a friend to Mr. Webster. "It is high time that the people of this country should know what this Constitution is." "Then," said Webster, "by the blessing of heaven, they shall learn this day before the sun goes down what I understand it to be." Nationality was Webster's theme, and his sole purpose was to strengthen the claims of the Union. For 4 hours, he held his audience spellbound as he set forth with convincing logic the meaning of the Constitution. The great orator won an overwhelming victory. Not only were many of his hearers in the Senate chamber that day convinced, but loyal Americans all over the country were inspired with more earnest devotion to the Union. His last words, "Liberty and Union, one and inseparable now and forever," electrified his countrymen and became a watchword of national progress. Webster's power as an orator was enhanced by his remarkable physique. His striking personal appearance made a deep impression on everyone who saw or heard him. One day, while walking through the streets of Liverpool, a laborer said of him, "There goes a king." On another occasion, Sidney Smith exclaimed, "Good heavens, he is a small cathedral by himself." Webster was nearly 6 feet tall, with a massive head, a broad, deep brow, and great coal-black eyes that, once seen, could never be forgotten. From the moment of his birth, Daniel Webster was destined for greatness. And though he has since passed from this world, his legacy lives on. He was a man who loved his country with a fierce and unyielding passion, and who worked tirelessly to make it strong. In the final weeks of his life, as he lay awake in his bed, Webster would often gaze out his window at the stars, and there, in the darkness, he would see the flag of his beloved Union, flying proudly on a small boat that he had anchored just offshore. The stars and stripes would be raised at 6 in the evening, and would fly until 6 in the morning, a testament to Webster's unwavering devotion to his country. And when he finally passed away, a stranger looked upon his lifeless face and spoke the truth. "Daniel Webster, the world without you will be lonesome." But though he is gone, his impact on America will never be forgotten, for he was a man who held many high positions and who had a profound influence on the affairs of the nation. And though he was not without his faults, we can count him among the greatest of Americans, a true patriot who loved his country until the very end. Chapter 23. Samuel Finley Breese Morse and the Electric Telegraph. The power of the steamboat and the railroad was great indeed in hastening the progress of society. But even greater was the influence of the electric telegraph in connecting far-flung communities. The steamboat and the railroad made travel and transportation easier and allowed for frequent communication through letters and newspapers. But the electric telegraph allowed men to send their thoughts across thousands of miles in mere seconds. The inventor of this remarkable device was Samuel Finley Breese Morse. Morse was born in 1791 in a house at the foot of Breed's Hill in Charlestown, Massachusetts. His father was a learned minister who, as Daniel Webster once said, was always thinking, always writing, always talking, always acting. His mother was a woman of noble character who instilled in her son a sense of purpose and determination. At the age of 4, Morse was sent to a school run by an elderly woman known as Old Ma'am Rand. Despite her limp, she was a strict disciplinarian who kept a long rattan stick close at hand to quickly reach any misbehaving students. Morse did not stay long under Old Ma'am Rand's tutelage, however. At the age of 7, he began attending school in Andover, and later enrolled in Phillips Academy in the same town. At the age of 14, he entered Yale College, where he quickly established himself as a thoughtful and diligent student. Soon Morse's 2 brothers joined him at college. As their father was poor, the boys had to support themselves. Morse used his talent for drawing to earn money, painting miniature likenesses of his classmates and professors on ivory. He charged $5 for a full miniature and $1 for a profile. After completing his studies at Yale, Morse decided to pursue painting as a career, and sought out the best instruction he could find. He became friends with the renowned artist Washington Allston, and traveled with him to London to study under Benjamin West, who had also been Robert Fulton's teacher. Morse was a young man of gentle and sunny disposition, and he quickly won the affection of his new teacher. West held his pupils to the highest standards, as the following instance shows. On one occasion, after spending much time making what he considered a finished drawing, Morse presented it to West for criticism. Upon careful examination, the master praised it highly and then added, "Very well, sir, very well. Go on and finish it." "It is finished," was Morse's reply. "Oh, no," said Mr. West. "Look here and here and here," pointing to defects in the drawing. After spending another week on it, Morse took it to his teacher. Again, Mr. West praised it and added, "Very well indeed, sir. Go on and finish it." "Is it not finished?" Morse asked with surprise and disappointment in his voice. "Not yet," said his critic. Morse spent 3 or 4 more days trying to perfect the work, and again handed it to his teacher, who, after again praising it, said, "Well, sir, go and finish it." "I cannot finish it," said Morse, by this time thoroughly disheartened. "Well," replied Mr. West, "I have tried you long enough. Now, sir, you have learned more by this drawing than you would have accomplished in double the time by a dozen half-finished beginnings. It is not numerous drawings, but the character of one, which makes a thorough draftsman. Finish one picture, sir, and you are a painter." After 4 years of study, Morse returned to Boston. But in the meantime, like Fulton, he had gradually turned his thought from painting to invention. His energies were now, for many years, divided between the two. During these years, Morse had to depend mainly on drawing and painting for a livelihood. He traveled through New Hampshire and Vermont, and even as far as South Carolina, painting miniatures on ivory, and establishing his reputation as an artist. In 1829, he went once more to Europe to study and remained for 3 years. But upon his return, although painting occupied much of his time, his career as an artist ended. His change of vocation turned upon an incident during his voyage home. On the ocean liner, the talk at dinner one evening turned to the latest experiments with electricity. The question on everyone's mind was whether the length of a wire affected the speed of an electric current passing through it. Dr. Jackson, one of the guests, claimed that based on current experiments, electricity traveled through any length of wire instantaneously. Morse, intrigued by this idea, proposed that if electricity could travel 10 miles without stopping, then it could be sent around the globe, allowing thoughts to be transmitted instantly across thousands of miles. This was the birth of the telegraph, a revolutionary idea that would change the world forever. Morse became obsessed with the idea, working tirelessly day and night to perfect the mechanical appliances needed for his invention. He spent 12 long years struggling to devise the machinery, all while providing for his 3 motherless children by teaching painting lessons to a few pupils. His brothers allowed him to use a room on the 5th floor of their building in New York on the corner of Nassau and Beekman Streets. Here, Morse worked tirelessly, sleeping little and eating meagerly, surviving mainly on crackers and tea. He was so poor that he bought his provisions at night to avoid his friends discovering his need. Despite the hardship, Morse persisted, giving painting lessons to keep starvation at bay. On one occasion he asked a student who owed him a quarter's tuition, "Well, Struthers, my boy, how are we off for money?" The young man spoke. "I'm sorry to say I've been let down, but I'll have the money next week." "Next week!" cried the destitute teacher. "I'll be dead by then." "Dead, sir," replied Struthers. "Yes, dead from starvation," was the emphatic response. "Would $10 be of any help?" asked the student, now realizing the gravity of the situation. $10 would save my life," replied the poor man, who had gone without food for a full day. Struthers quickly handed over the money. Despite numerous setbacks and hardships, by 1837 he had completed a machine which he showcased in New York. Among the audience was a talented and inventive young man named Alfred Vail. Impressed, he told Morse that he believed the telegraph would be successful and later became his business partner. Vail's father and brother were wealthy industrialists, and he himself was skilled in working with brass. Morse was pleased to have him as a partner, especially for his financial backing. Young Vail was full of hope and enthusiasm, and was instrumental in designing suitable equipment for the telegraph. However, it wasn't until 1840 that a patent was secured. Then followed a long and arduous effort to persuade the government in Washington to adopt and implement the invention. Finally, after much delay, the House of Representatives passed a bill appropriating $30,000 for a trial of the telegraph. As you may know, a bill cannot become a law unless the Senate also passes it. But the Senate did not seem inclined to favor this one. Many people believed that the whole idea of the telegraph was foolish. They regarded Morse and the telegraph much as people had viewed Fulton and the steamboat and ridiculed him as a madman. On the evening of the last day of the session, the bill had not yet been considered by the Senate. Morse sat anxiously waiting in the Senate chamber until nearly midnight when, believing there was no longer any hope, he withdrew and went home with a heavy heart.